The air inside Thorne's high-security lab hung thick and cloying, a cocktail of ozone, burnt polymer, and something else, something metallic and sharp, like seared flesh. My respirator filtered the worst of it, but the stench still prickled the back of my throat, a grim welcome to a scene of utter devastation. Twisted rebar jutted from shattered walls, scientific equipment lay in skeletal heaps, their delicate circuits fused into grotesque modern art. The overhead lights, miraculously still flickering in some sections, cast long, dancing shadows over the debris, making the destruction seem even more profound. "Reid, glad you could make it," the lead detective grunted, his voice muffled by his own mask. He gestured broadly at the chaos. "Looks like a bad day at the office for Dr. Thorne. Or maybe a really, really bad last day." I nodded, my gaze already sweeping past the obvious, cataloging the subtle. The detective, a veteran named Miller, was good at the big picture, the immediate answers. But the devil, as always, lived in the microscopic. "What's the preliminary?" I asked, pulling on a fresh pair of nitrile gloves. My kit, a heavy aluminum case of precision instruments, felt reassuringly solid in my grip. "Accident, most likely," Miller said, kicking gently at a pile of what looked like fused glass. "Or suicide. The preliminary report from the response team suggests a major energy surge, possibly from the experimental reactor Thorne was working on. Containment breach. Boom. His bodies. Well, what's left of it is over there." He pointed to a section of the lab where a dark, irregular outline stained the scorched floor, partially obscured by a blast shield that had been ripped from its moorings. "High-temperature event. Probably instant." I walked towards the outline, my boots crunching on shattered ceramic tiles. The heat signature was still faint on the infrared scanner I held, a ghostly echo of the inferno that had consumed Dr. Aris Thorne. The victim, a brilliant bioengineer, now reduced to a grim stain. My initial assessment mirrored Miller's. The scale of the destruction, the focused nature of the blast, it all screamed catastrophic failure. Or a desperate, self-inflicted end to a life burdened by genius. But as I knelt, my eyes traced the periphery of the primary blast zone. The scorching on the floor was intense, radiating outwards in a starburst pattern, consistent with an explosion centered near where Thorne's body had been. Yet, something snagged my attention. A faint, almost imperceptible discoloration on a stainless steel workbench, just outside the immediate blast radius. It wasn't the charcoal black of intense heat, nor the gray-white of an electrical arc. It was a subtle, almost iridescent blue-green sheen, no bigger than my thumbnail. I leaned closer, adjusting the magnification on my ocular loop. The sheen was embedded in the microscopic imperfections of the metal, almost fused with it. It wasn't residue from the explosion. It was too precise, too isolated. And the color. I'd seen similar reactions before, but never in the context of a typical lab accident. This suggested a specific chemical interaction, one that required an intentional application, not a random splash from a volatile reaction. "Anything, Reid?" Miller called out, observing me from a respectful distance. "Just taking it all in," I replied, my voice calm, belying the knot of suspicion tightening in my gut. I carefully scraped a minute sample of the iridescent trace into a sterile vial, then took a series of macro photographs. The trace was microscopic, easily overlooked amidst the larger devastation. Most would dismiss it as another byproduct of the chaos. But my mind was already spinning, trying to fit this tiny, anomalous piece into the grand puzzle of destruction. It didn't fit. Not with an accident, and certainly not with a suicide. If Thorne had triggered an explosion, why would this specific chemical signature be present outside the primary blast, in such a controlled, localized manner? I moved away from the main blast area, my attention now drawn to Thorne's desk, miraculously spared from the worst of the inferno, though coated in a fine layer of ash and debris. My gloved fingers brushed aside a broken monitor screen, revealing a half-open drawer. Inside, amidst scattered pens and a crumpled energy bar wrapper, lay a small, tarnished silver locket. It was old, the kind handed down through generations, and out of place in such a futuristic lab. It wasn't what caught my eye, though. Tucked beneath it was a single, folded piece of parchment, brittle with age and water damage, its edges singed but the central text intact. I carefully unfolded it. The script was faded, handwritten in looping, elegant strokes. It wasn't a scientific paper, or a personal letter. It was a list of dates, names, and what appeared to be institutional codes. At the bottom, in stark, precise block letters, was an address. My eyes widened slightly as I read it: Psychiatric Hospital Abandoned Wing with Old Records. The words seemed to jump off the page, an unexpected anomaly in a scene already riddled with questions. A psychiatric hospital? Why would Thorne, a reclusive bioengineer, have such a document secreted away in his desk? The connection felt tenuous, yet persistent. This wasn't just a lab accident. This wasn't just a suicide. The iridescent trace, the peculiar document, they were discordant notes in an otherwise deafening symphony of destruction. Someone had gone to great lengths to make this look like an accident, but they weren't meticulous enough. Or perhaps, they hadn't anticipated me. Thorne's death was no accident. And the psychiatric hospital abandoned wing with old records might just hold the first key. My initial assessment had been a gut feeling, a prickle of unease that went beyond the raw destruction. Now, standing over what remained of Dr. Aris Thorne, that unease solidified into a cold certainty. The forensic examiner, a meticulous individual with tired eyes, worked with a precision that belied the grim task. We weren't in a sterile medical facility. This examination was being conducted in a secure, temporary clean room set up within the compound, a necessary precaution given the hazardous nature of Thorne's final project. The air scrubbers hummed, a low, constant drone. Cause of death, preliminarily, severe thermal trauma and blast injuries, the examiner stated, his voice flat, professional. He gestured with a gloved hand towards the charred remains. Consistent with the lab explosion. I nodded, my gaze fixed on the details. Anything inconsistent? He paused, adjusting a microscopic lens. That's where it gets interesting, Reid. It's a localized burn, deeper, more defined than the general blast burns. Almost like a contact burn, but not from the explosion itself. The surrounding tissue shows signs of post-mortem thermal damage, but this particular spot. It's different. I leaned closer, my breath held. Under the magnification, the pattern was distinct, almost geometric, like a branding. It didn't look like a splash, or an impact from shrapnel. What caused it? Still analyzing. But here's the kicker. The examiner carefully scraped a tiny sample from the edge of the unique burn. We found trace elements embedded in this specific area. Not present anywhere else on the remains, nor in the general debris field we've sampled from the lab floor. It's a silicate dust, a very specific composition. Not lab grade. Not even industrial grade common in this region. My internal alarm bells, already jangling, now rang with a deafening clamor. A unique silicate dust, a distinct burn pattern. This wasn't a tragic miscalculation. This was something else entirely. Where would I find this kind of silicate? The examiner shrugged, a slight movement within his protective suit. That's your territory, Reid. My preliminary analysis suggests it's consistent with a very rare type of mineral dust, typically found in specific geological formations, not manufactured. Think volcanic ash, but from a very particular type of eruption, or perhaps from certain ancient, naturally occurring rock formations. A deliberate act. Someone had left a signature, however microscopic. My mind immediately went to Thorne's research, groundbreaking, potentially world-changing. Such work bred fierce competition. My first stop was the corporate headquarters, a gleaming tower that felt miles away from the scorched lab. Silas Vance, another bioengineer, known for his cutthroat ambition. Vance was a man of sharp angles and restless energy, his office sparse, almost aggressive in its minimalism. He stood by a window, looking down at the city, when I entered. "Investigator," he greeted, turning with a practiced, almost too smooth smile. His eyes, however, were cold, assessing. "Dr. Vance, I'm here regarding Dr. Thorne," I began, observing the tension in his jaw. "A tragic loss," Vance said, his voice devoid of genuine emotion. Aris was brilliant and terribly reckless. Always pushing boundaries, never minding the consequences. Were you familiar with his recent work? As much as anyone, he replied, a hint of disdain in his tone. He was notoriously secretive. Hoarded his discoveries. It was an open secret, his refusal to collaborate, even within the same organization. He saw everyone as a rival. Did you consider yourself a rival? Vance scoffed. We operated in different spheres, mostly. Though, yes, we both vied for the same funding, the same accolades. His methods, however, were unorthodox. I preferred a more transparent approach. But I certainly wasn't the only one he alienated. He paused, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. There was a former assistant. Maya. He had a particularly difficult time with him. Very bright, but Thorne drove her to the brink. She left in a storm of accusations. Do you know where I can find her? I asked, already sensing my next lead. Vance provided an address, a vacant apartment, and a contact number that he claimed was old. Last I heard, he was struggling. Might have been looking for old records related to her work with Thorne. The one Vance mentioned was part of a sprawling, forgotten complex, the kind of place that time and progress had simply bypassed. I found her in a section that once housed administrative offices, now crumbling and overgrown. The sign above the rusted gates still read, in faded, chipped letters, Psychiatric Hospital Abandoned Wing with Old Records. The irony wasn't lost on me. Dust motes danced in the weak shafts of light filtering through grimy windows. The air was thick with the smell of decay, damp plaster, and forgotten paper. I moved carefully, my boots scuffing on debris, my hand on my sidearm. I heard a faint rustling, then the unmistakable sound of a drawer being pulled open. "Maya?" I called out, my voice echoing in the cavernous space. A figure startled, dropping a stack of yellowed files. She spun around, her eyes wide with fear, framed by tangled hair. He looked gaunt, his clothes rumpled, a wildness in his gaze. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice hoarse. "Reid. Investigator. I need to ask you about Dr. Thorne." Her face contorted, a mixture of anger and raw grief. "Thorne? That monster. He stole my work, twisted it into something dangerous. He ruined me." She gestured around the dusty room, at the piles of disintegrating files. "I've been trying to find proof. Something to show what he did, what he was truly capable of." "What exactly did he do, Maya?" I asked, stepping closer, my gaze sweeping over the archaic records, then back to her. The unique silicate dust from Thorne's arm, the ancient rock formations. A connection, however tenuous, formed in my mind. Was this dusty archive somehow tied to that trace? Or was Maya's desperation merely a reflection of Thorne's ruthless ambition, another victim in a lone line? The tension in the air was palpable, the answers hidden somewhere in the past, buried beneath layers of corporate secrets and personal vendettas. Or was it just another dead end in a case already overflowing with them? The air in the abandoned municipal archive wing hung heavy, thick with the scent of decaying paper and forgotten dust. Sunlight, fractured by grimy windows, illuminated motes dancing in the stillness. Maya pulled her thin jacket tighter, her shoulders hunched. Her eyes, usually so sharp and focused, were now wide and skittish, darting between the towering shelves of bound ledgers and my face. He was looking for something specific, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the distant rumble of city traffic. Something old. He spent weeks in places like this. Not just here, others. Always about the past, about origins. She gestured vaguely at the shelves. He said if you wanted to understand the future, you had to dig into the deepest roots of the past. Roots of what? I pressed, my patience thinning. The silicate dust was a physical trace, a fact. Her pronouncements were riddles. Maya wrung her hands. He didn't say. Not explicitly. But he became obsessive. Paranoid, even. He thought he was being watched. That his work was too important, too dangerous, to be left alone. She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the scuffed linoleum floor. He started locking down everything. Even from me. Encrypted files, restricted server access. It wasn't like him, Reid. Not the Thorne I knew. Did he ever mention who might be watching him? She shook her head, a tremor running through her. Just them. He'd mutter about them wanting his research, them trying to steal his discoveries. Said they wouldn't understand the implications, that they would weaponize it. Her voice hitched. I tried to tell him to slow down, to rest. He just worked harder, fueled by fear, I think. Her words were unsettling, painting a picture of a man spiraling into delusion or, more chillingly, a man who truly was being hunted. The thought gnawed at me. If Thorne was under surveillance, then his lab accident might have been anything but. I knew these old records, however intriguing, weren't the immediate answer. The truth, or at least the next layer of it, lay back at Thorne's high-security research facility, deep within the digital heart of his classified projects. The silicate dust from his arm, the strange burn patterns, they demanded a closer look at the environment where he spent his final hours. The drive back to the research facility was a blur of urban sprawl and anxious thoughts. The facility itself was a fortress of steel and reinforced concrete, a stark contrast to the crumbling archive. Inside, the sterile scent of ozone and disinfectant hung heavy, mingling with the faint, metallic tang of burnt electronics that still lingered from the incident. The primary investigator, a burly officer named Miller, met me at the main entrance, his expression grim. "Still nothing concrete, Reid," Miller grunted, running a hand over his close-cropped hair. "Forensics teams are still sifting through the debris, but it's a mess. Looks like an overload, just like we thought." "I need access to Thorne's workstation, Miller," I stated, bypassing the pleasantries. "Specifically, his secure server and project files." Miller hesitated, then nodded. "It's all isolated, per protocol. We haven't touched the primary drives yet, just imaged them." Thorne's personal workstation, a sleek, powerful machine, sat on a reinforced steel desk. The air in here was slightly cooler, the hum of its internal components the only sound. I booted the system, bypassing security protocols with a specialized forensic key. The desktop loaded, a minimalist interface Thorne had designed himself. I navigated to his project directories, a cascade of encrypted folders. The names themselves hinted at the scope of his ambition: Project Chimera, Genesis Sequence, Apex Strain. My fingers flew across the keyboard, decrypting the top-level files. The initial data was overwhelming: intricate genetic sequencing patterns, complex protein structures, simulations of cellular regeneration. Thorne's research was indeed groundbreaking, focusing on advanced genetic manipulation with potential applications ranging from revolutionary global health treatments to, terrifyingly, highly targeted bioweaponry. The sheer ethical tightrope he must have walked was dizzying. As I delved deeper, sifting through lines of code and data logs, a discrepancy caught my eye. There were multiple access points from an external IP address, not Thorne's, several days before the incident. More concerning, these accesses were followed by a sophisticated, almost surgical, data manipulation. Specific files, critical to understanding the Genesis sequence's true purpose, had been altered. Not deleted, but subtly modified, their parameters shifted just enough to render them misleading, if not outright useless, without the original key. My breath hitched. This wasn't a clumsy hack, it was an artisan's touch. Someone intimately familiar with Thorne's methodology, his specific coding style, had gone in and meticulously rewritten portions of his most sensitive data. And then, as if to cover their tracks completely, there was a log of an attempted, albeit incomplete, wipe of all associated access logs. The system's robust safeguards had partially thwarted the deletion, leaving behind ghost files and partial timestamps, just enough for a meticulous eye to find. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't even Thorne trying to hide something himself, not with this level of external infiltration. This was a deliberate act of sabotage, a calculated effort to obscure the true nature of his final project. Maya's fear, Thorne's paranoia, it all clicked into place. He hadn't been delusional. He'd been right. Someone had been inside. Someone had been watching. And they had taken what they wanted, then tried to bury the evidence. The tension in the room thickened, pressing down on me. Thorne wasn't just a victim of a lab accident, he was a casualty of a far larger, far more dangerous game. And I had just stumbled onto its playing field. I ran my gloved hand over the cool, polished surface of Thorne's desk. No scorch marks here, no residue from the blast. This was his sanctuary, his thought crucible. It was locked, of course. But the blast residue from the main chamber. It's peculiar. Not just the usual carbonized remains. I had brought a small, sealed sample with me, a fleck no larger than a grain of sand, collected from the periphery of the explosion. It was this microscopic anomaly that had gnawed me since I first saw the site. Back at my own facility, hours later, I prepared the sample for spectral analysis. The forensic lab was quiet, bathed in the cool glow of various diagnostic machines. I placed the tiny fragment into the chamber of the mass spectrometer, a device I trusted more than any human testimony. Its intricate lenses and detectors would dissect the sample's atomic structure, revealing its true identity. The machine whirred to life, a low, mechanical growl preceding the delicate dance of electrons and photons. I watched the readouts on the screen, a cascade of peaks and troughs, each representing an element, a compound. The initial data was predictable: carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, the building blocks of organic matter, the remnants of Thorne's materials. But then, a distinct signature emerged, sharp and anomalous, a spike on the graph that didn't belong. I zoomed in, adjusting the parameters, running the scan again and again. There it was, unequivocally. A rare earth element, complexly bonded. It wasn't organic, not biological. It was a synthetic polymer, engineered with precision, designed for extreme durability and specific conductive properties. I cross-referenced the unique spectral fingerprint against known databases, filtering through thousands of industrial compounds. The search narrowed quickly, then snapped to a single match. It was a proprietary compound, a specialized polymer used in high-end industrial applications, particularly in advanced robotics and aerospace components. A material known for its incredible strength-to-weight ratio and its resistance to extreme temperatures. It shouldn't have been anywhere near Thorne's biological research, let alone embedded in the blast residue of his lab. The only entity known to heavily invest in the development and exclusive use of such advanced materials was Omnicorp, a conglomerate notorious for its aggressive research and development, often bordering on clandestine. My initial theory of a lab accident, or even suicide, disintegrated. This was deliberate, calculated, and pointed directly to an outside influence. The polymer, designed to withstand immense force and heat, suggested a device, an activator, or even a containment vessel that had been deliberately introduced and then destroyed, leaving only this microscopic, telling trace. I arranged an interview with Omnicorp's liaison, a man named Sterling, for the following morning. His office was on the 30th floor of Omnicorp Tower, a monolith of glass and steel that pierced the city skyline. The reception area was minimalist, all polished chrome and muted tones, designed to impress and intimidate. Sterling was a man in his late 40s, impeccably dressed, with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He greeted me with an outstretched hand, his grip firm, almost rehearsed. "Investigator Reid, thank you for coming. We're, of course, deeply saddened by Dr. Thorne's untimely demise. A brilliant mind, truly. Indeed, I said, taking the seat he offered, a plush leather armchair that swallowed me slightly. His desk was spotless, devoid of any personal effects, reinforcing the corporate facade. My investigation has led me to a few questions regarding Omnicorp's connection to Dr. Thorne's research. We had a collaborative agreement, Sterling stated smoothly, leaning back in his chair, fingers steepled. Funding, primarily. His work was groundbreaking, as you know. We saw potential synergies with our own advanced materials division. And the nature of these synergies? I pressed. Specifically, a synthetic polymer, highly specialized, with a unique spectral signature. It was found at the blast site. Sterling's smile flickered, a momentary tremor. He cleared his throat. A polymer? That's unexpected. Our funding was for his biological research, entirely separate from materials science. He paused, his gaze drifting to the panoramic window, as if searching for an answer among the clouds. Unless, perhaps a historical connection? Dr. Thorne was known for his eclectic interests. I recall a project from years ago, before Omnicorp's involvement, where he dabbled in bio-integrated materials. Something about neural interfaces, and the data was stored off-site, in an old facility. Which facility? I asked, leaning forward, sensing a shift in his carefully constructed narrative. He hesitated, then sighed, a performance of reluctant cooperation. It was an old storage annex, long since decommissioned. A place we acquired years ago, mostly for its land value. The records, if they still exist, would be in the archives of a psychiatric hospital abandoned wing with old records that Omnicorp briefly owned. We divested it years ago, but some of the older, less digitized records might still be there. A long shot, I assure you. Thorne was quite secretive even then. A long shot I'll take, I replied, my gaze unwavering. His overly cooperative demeanor, the sudden recollection of an obscure, defunct location, felt less like helpfulness and more like a carefully placed distraction. The rare polymer, the evasive liaison, and now this cryptic lead to a forgotten archive, the web of connections was beginning to form, and it felt far more sinister than a simple accident. I had a new destination, and a growing certainty that Sterling knew more than he was letting on. The tension in the room, previously masked by corporate pleasantries, was now palpable. The lead that corporate liaison offered, tenuous as it felt, was all I had. I found it nestled at the edge of the industrial district, a sprawling, derelict structure that once served as the psychiatric hospital abandoned wing with old records. Rust streaked down the brickwork like dried blood, and shattered window panes gazed out with empty eyes. The air inside was thick with the scent of decay, dust, and something metallic, a faint tang that only amplified the desolation. I navigated the labyrinthine corridors, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. Stacks of yellowed folders teetered precariously on shelves, their contents a testament to forgotten lives and obsolete technologies. My objective wasn't medical records, but the obscure industrial patents that might have been stored here, cross-referenced with regional manufacturing grants from decades past. The liaison's vague hint about a unique polymer, one used in specialized insulation, had led me down this rabbit hole. Hours bled into each other as I meticulously sifted through binders brittle with age. My fingers grew grimy, my eyes strained. A patent application for a polymer, incredibly resistant to heat and pressure, developed by a defunct regional research consortium. The chemical composition was complex, beyond my immediate expertise, but the structural diagram showed a unique lattice pattern. A specific, rare variant. It matched the microscopic trace I'd found. The connection was tenuous, but it was there. I carefully photographed the relevant pages, the old paper crumbling slightly under my touch. My mind raced, piecing together fragments. This wasn't off-the-shelf material. Someone had gone to great lengths to acquire it, or knew exactly where to find the historical data for its recreation. The implications tightened around me. Exiting the abandoned wing, the late afternoon sun felt blinding after the perpetual twilight within. The street was quiet, a forgotten back road rarely used. As I reached for my door handle, a sudden, guttural roar shattered the stillness. A black sedan, old and without license plates, accelerated from a side alley, tires squealing. It veered sharply, heading directly for me. My reflexes, honed by years of navigating unpredictable scenes, kicked in. I dove, rolling behind a rusted dumpster just as the car screeched past, the wind of its passage whipping at my jacket. The sedan didn't stop. It sped off, disappearing around the next corner as quickly as it had appeared. My heart hammered against my ribs, a dull thud. This wasn't an accident. The precision, the speed, the silent approach, it was a warning. Someone knew I was getting too close. Back in my personal lab, the familiar scent of reagents and clean metal usually brought a sense of calm. Not today. The near miss had left a bitter taste, a heightened sense of vigilance. I ran through my notes, trying to connect the polymer to anything Thorne was working on. Nothing obvious jumped out. The material was too obscure, too specialized. As I reached for the microspectrometer, I paused. The small, heavy device was usually positioned precisely in the center of its mat, its power cable neatly coiled. Now, it was a hair off-center, the cable slightly askew. Imperceptible to anyone but me, someone who used it daily, who knew the exact placement of every tool. I moved slowly, checking the door, the windows. No forced entry. No obvious signs. But the faint, almost imperceptible scent of a clean, industrial solvent lingered in the air, a scent I didn't use. A cold certainty settled in my gut. My lab had been breached. Not ransacked, not damaged, but inspected. Someone had been here, looking for something, or perhaps just confirming my activities. The message was clear, my movements were being watched. My investigation was a threat. Just as I was cataloging the subtle disturbance, my phone vibrated, startling me. It was Maya. His voice was thin, strained, barely above a whisper. "Reid," he choked out, I need to tell you something. I can't keep it in anymore. I'm terrified." "What is it, Maya?" I pressed, my voice low, my attention snapping to her. Before it happened, she began, a shaky breath, "I saw someone. Late at night. A few times. Not Thorne. Not anyone I recognized. They were going into the lab. The main research lab. I thought maybe it was just a late-night delivery, or a colleague I didn't know. But they were always so quiet, so careful. And they never used the main entrance, always the service tunnel, the one Thorne rarely used." My mind raced, connecting her words to the targeted breach of my lab, the near miss on the forgotten road. An unknown individual, accessing Thorne's high-security lab after hours, using a discreet entrance, days before his death. It wasn't an accident. It was never an accident. This wasn't about a miscalculation. This was a deliberate, calculated act. And someone was desperate to keep me from uncovering the truth. The game had just escalated. The certainty settled over me like a shroud, chilling yet clarifying. It wasn't an accident. This wasn't about a miscalculation, but a meticulously orchestrated act. The knowledge was a lead weight in my gut, demanding immediate, unyielding action. I needed to dissect Thorne's final moments, not just for the cause of death, but for the architect of his demise. I retreated to my temporary workspace, a desolate corner of the psychiatric hospital abandoned wing with old records. Cracked linoleum peeled from the floor, and dusty patient files lay scattered in forgotten boxes, their contents whispering faded histories. Here, amidst the quiet decay, I could focus, shielded from the scrutiny of the authorities and the prying eyes of whoever orchestrated Thorne's death. My fingers danced across the keyboard, navigating through layers of Thorne's lab security logs. Days blurred into a relentless stream of data. I started with the environmental control systems, the lifeblood of any bioengineering lab. Temperature, humidity, atmospheric composition, Thorne's work demanded absolute precision. The initial reports indicated a sudden, catastrophic pressure spike, followed by a rapid depressurization event, consistent with a research malfunction. But my gut screamed otherwise. I isolated the timestamps for the hours leading up to the incident. The data was a dense forest of numbers, but I hunted for anomalies. Small fluctuations, barely perceptible, began to emerge, subtle shifts in the oxygen-nitrogen mix, minute alterations in the filtration cycles. Not enough to trigger an alarm, but enough to nudge the delicate balance of Thorne's bespoke experimental chamber. It was like watching a predator stalk its prey, inch by calculated inch. Then, I shifted to the equipment diagnostics. Each one should have engaged during a pressure anomaly. Yet, the system logs showed them bypassed, one after another, in a precise sequence. Not a random failure, but a deliberate deactivation. This required intimate knowledge of Thorne's custom-built hardware and proprietary software. A stranger wouldn't even know where to begin. I pulled up the remote access logs. There it was. A ghost in the machine. The commands weren't direct system overrides, which would have tripped alarms instantly. Instead, they were subtle parameter adjustments, cascading over a short period, designed to push the system to its breaking point without ever registering as a direct attack. First, a fractional increase in the internal temperature of the bioreactor's primary coolant loop, just shy of the threshold for a warning. Then, a minor desynchronization in the atmospheric regulators, causing an imperceptible buildup of inert gases. Individually, each adjustment was benign, easily dismissed as sensor drift or minor calibration issues. But together, they were a meticulously crafted death sentence. The remote trigger wasn't a single button press, it was a sequence of almost invisible nudges, like setting up a row of dominoes. Thorne, engrossed in his work, oblivious. The lab's intricate systems, slowly, subtly, being turned against him. The fractional temperature rise weakening a critical seal. The inert gas buildup creating a pocket of instability. Then, the final, remote command, a brief, intense surge in the bioreactor's internal pressure, exploiting the now compromised system. The rupture wouldn't have been an accident, it would have been the inevitable climax of a carefully orchestrated chain reaction. This wasn't about brute force or simple hacking. This was about understanding Thorne's specific research, his unique equipment, and the precise vulnerabilities of his cutting-edge protocols. The perpetrator knew his lab better than most, perhaps even better than Thorne himself. They understood the delicate dance of his experiments, the thresholds, the failsafes, and how to circumvent every single one. My gaze drifted to the ancient, water-stained ceiling of the abandoned wing. The killer had taken extraordinary measures to hide their tracks, not just in the lab, but in the digital ether. The proxy network was a labyrinth, designed to obscure their origin. But the method itself, the signature of the sabotage, spoke volumes. It pointed to someone deeply embedded in Thorne's world, someone who could walk into that lab and know exactly which levers to pull, virtually or physically, to create a fatal illusion. The implications were vast, and the ground beneath me felt less stable than the crumbling floorboards of this desolate place. I had unmasked the sabotage, but the saboteur remained shrouded, a ghost with a genius for destruction. It wasn't an accident. It was never an accident. The killer hadn't just wanted the research. If it were mere theft, they could have simply taken the data, perhaps even framed it as a suicide to cover their tracks. But the sheer complexity of the scene, the deliberate, almost theatrical destruction that simultaneously erased and misled, spoke of a deeper, more insidious motive. This wasn't about acquiring Thorne's work, it was about preventing its completion, its release, its very existence. The killer wanted Thorne silenced, his message buried. My focus shifted from the scorch marks and chemical residues to the digital footprint Thorne had left behind. I returned to the secure terminal at the investigative facility, the one mirroring Thorne's lab computer. The digital forensics specialist, a sharp-eyed analyst who preferred the glow of multiple monitors to sunlight, had already extracted everything. But I wasn't looking for obvious files, I was looking for the ghost in the machine, the data meant to be hidden. Anything unusual in the log files? I asked, leaning over the analyst's shoulder. The analyst shook their head, fingers dancing across a keyboard. Clean. Standard backups, routine system checks. Nothing flagged. If he hid something, he did it well. He did everything well, I muttered, my gaze sweeping across lines of code. Thorne was a genius, obsessive in his methods. He wouldn't just delete a file, he'd bury it under layers of misdirection. My eyes ached, but the adrenaline kept them wide. Hours blurred. Then, a flicker. A small, almost imperceptible discrepancy in a directory named archived_legacy_projects. It contained what appeared to be old, defunct codebases, but one subfolder, timestamped just days before Thorne's death, had a file size that was disproportionately large for its supposed content. It was named Chronos_Beto_review.docs, a bland, unassuming title. This one, I pointed, my voice low. Check the checksum. And scan for steganography. The analyst initiated the process. The tension in the room thickened, almost palpable. The machine whirred louder for a moment, then settled into a low thrum. A few agonizing minutes later, the analyst's eyebrows shot up. There's an encrypted container embedded within it. Strong encryption. Looks like AES 256. A grim satisfaction settled over me. Thorne hadn't just hidden it, he'd fortified it. This was what I'd been looking for. Can you crack it? It'll take time. A lot of time. Unless there's a key or a passphrase hint somewhere in his other files. I remembered Thorne's meticulous nature, his love for puzzles. I started digging through his personal notes, his emails, even his browser history, searching for anything that looked like a pattern or a reference. I relayed the phrase to the analyst. The screen flashed, then went blank for a second. My breath hitched. The text scrolled, revealing Thorne's own words, raw and urgent. He detailed his growing unease with Omnicorp's true intentions behind funding his research. He wrote of his groundbreaking bioengineering being twisted, perverted into something he never intended, a weapon. He wasn't just developing advanced biological agents, Omnicorp was secretly funding a parallel project, Project Genesis, which exploited his foundational work to create something far more dangerous, something designed for widespread, targeted incapacitation, not healing. Thorne wrote of his moral torment, his attempts to distance himself, and finally, his decision to expose Omnicorp. He had gathered irrefutable evidence, not just of Project Genesis, but of Omnicorp's historical pattern of unethical experimentation, veiled under various guises. He even mentioned a specific instance, a series of early human trials conducted decades ago, records of which he believed were still stored in an abandoned wing of an old institution. His plan was to go public, to reveal everything. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier. The killer hadn't just prevented the completion of Thorne's work, they had prevented the world from learning the truth about Omnicorp. They weren't just after his research, they were protecting a corporate empire built on a foundation of dangerous secrets and human exploitation. This wasn't a lab accident, it was a corporate assassination, and the stakes were far higher than I could have imagined. The mention of the abandoned institution snagged in my mind. A psychiatric hospital abandoned wing with old records. The digital trail was critical, but the tangible, forgotten records might hold the key to understanding the full scope of their depravity, and by extension, the killer's desperation. Thorne's words echoed in my mind, a frantic, desperate confession preserved in the digital amber of his journal. Twisted. Perverted. The implications were chilling. He hadn't just been researching, he'd been fighting, trying to reclaim his work from Omnicorp's grasp. The accidental death scenario, already flimsy, collapsed completely. This was no miscalculation, no suicide. My focus sharpened, the image of Thorne's mangled lab now overlaid with a new, insidious layer of intent. The killer hadn't just wanted him dead, they'd wanted his research compromised, or perhaps, stolen. The microscopic trace, the unusual burn pattern, they weren't anomalies, they were signatures. The list of individuals with the necessary technical skills was already short. The list of those with motive, however, was where the real work lay. Omnicorp was a behemoth, its shadow long, its secrets buried deep. My search led me down a winding path, away from the sleek, sterile corporate data centers and into the forgotten corners of the city's administrative history. The trail of the intellectual property scandal Thorne had alluded to, one that predated Omnicorp's current iteration but involved key players now deeply embedded, pointed to an obscure archive. It was a place where records too sensitive, too potentially damaging for conventional corporate storage, often found their final, dusty resting place, the psychiatric hospital abandoned wing with old records. It was a place designed for things to be forgotten, to molder away from prying eyes. Perfect, then, for the kind of discreet paper trail I was hunting. I moved methodically, my gloved hands disturbing decades of neglect. Rows of ancient, brittle files stretched before me, each labeled with cryptic codes or faded department names. My eyes scanned for anything related to Project Chimera, the precursor to Thorne's work that had been at the heart of the previous scandal. I pulled boxes, one after another, the cardboard crumbling at my touch, releasing clouds of fine gray powder. The irony wasn't lost on me, searching for a high-tech killer in a low-tech graveyard of paper. Hours bled into one another, my neck stiff, my eyes burning. I found fragments, names, dates, project outlines. I cross-referenced the names against the lab access logs I'd downloaded, sifting through the layers of corporate bureaucracy and technical jargon. The pattern began to emerge, a subtle thread connecting the past to the present. The name on the tab made my breath catch, David Thorne. Omnicorp liaison. No relation to Aris Thorne, or so I'd been told. The paper felt different, thicker, almost like a military service record. And indeed, as I opened it, the first page detailed a background that sent a jolt through me. David Thorne, the smooth-talking corporate face, had a prior career in covert operations, specializing in industrial espionage and counterintelligence. The dates align perfectly with the period of the stolen intellectual property scandal, a scandal that had seen a rival company's bioengineering blueprints mysteriously disappear, only to resurface years later as Omnicorp intellectual property. The file detailed his retirement from that line of work, followed by his immediate recruitment by Omnicorp. His role? Strategic asset management. A euphemism, I now realized, for someone who knew how to acquire and protect valuable intellectual property by any means necessary. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality. David Thorne wasn't just a corporate suit, he was a ghost from Omnicorp's past, a professional operator. He had the access. And now, I had his motive. Aris Thorne was threatening to expose Omnicorp's true intentions, to reclaim his research, potentially unraveling not just the current project, but also the very foundation of Omnicorp's ill-gotten gains from the previous scandal. David Thorne would have been tasked with ensuring that didn't happen. The air in the abandoned wing suddenly felt heavier, charged with a new, pressing danger. The inside man wasn't just an employee, he was a specialist, a professional. And he was still out there. My next move had to be precise, or I could easily become his next obstacle. The digital echo of Aris Thorne's journal entry had burrowed deep, rattling my certainty. Twisted. Perverted. His words painted a picture not of a scientist's miscalculation, but of a desperate man fighting to reclaim something stolen, something weaponized. The accidental death scenario I'd meticulously dismantled now felt like a flimsy veil over a much darker truth. Omnicorp wasn't just a corporate entity, it was a shadow, and David Thorne, Aris's brother, was its willing instrument. I needed to flush him out. Logic told me he was watching, waiting for me to falter, to make a definitive move. The journal had given me the motive, the polymer trace, the method. Now I needed the confession. My trap was subtle, built on a lie that only the killer would recognize as a threat. The rumor, I had discovered a critical element, a breakthrough in Aris Thorne's research that not only confirmed the weaponized nature of his final project but also revealed a counteragent, a neutralizing frequency embedded within his original schematics. It was pure fiction, a phantom key to a phantom lock, but if David Thorne was protecting Omnicorp's bioweapon agenda, this news would be a direct assault on their plans. It implied I could disarm their investment. I chose my ground carefully, the psychiatric hospital abandoned wing with old records. It was a sprawling, forgotten hulk on the city's fringe, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at nothing. The perfect place for a clandestine meeting, or, in this case, a confrontation. I'd arranged a staged secure evidence review there, a meeting I knew David Thorne would intercept. The old records wing was a labyrinth of decaying shelves, stacked high with brittle files, their ink faded into illegibility. The air hung thick with the smell of mildew and forgotten lives. I arrived an hour early, setting up my own surveillance. A small, almost imperceptible camera in the corner, another hidden within a stack of medical charts. I wanted every nuance captured. I settled into a worn armchair, the stuffing long since collapsed, and waited. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the distant hum of city life and the occasional drip of water somewhere deep within the structure. My pulse kept a steady, low rhythm, a counterpoint to the building's decay. I imagined David Thorne, somewhere out there, receiving the carefully planted seed of information. Would he take the bait? An hour later, a faint scraping sound broke the stillness. Not from the main entrance, but from a side door, rarely used, that led to a service stairwell. David Thorne. He moved with a practiced stealth, a silhouette against the dim light of the corridor. No suit, no tie. He carried a small, nondescript bag. He was looking for my breakthrough, for the evidence I supposedly had. His eyes narrowed as he spotted the table I'd prepared, a single, empty evidence box sitting innocently in the center. He froze, his hand still in the bag. "What are you doing here?" His voice was smooth, betraying nothing. Too smooth. "Waiting for you," I replied, stepping out from behind a towering stack of records. Funny, I thought I was meeting an anonymous source about a significant development in Aris's work. Didn't expect you to show up. His jaw tightened. I heard a rumor. Concerned, naturally. Aris was my brother. Concerned enough to break into an abandoned building, armed with. What exactly is in that bag, David? I gestured to the satchel. Something to erase my breakthrough, perhaps? Or perhaps something to erase me? He let out a short, humorless laugh. Don't be ridiculous. I just wanted to see what you were digging up. Omnicorp has a vested interest in Aris's legacy. Omnicorp has a vested interest in keeping Aris's true legacy buried, I countered, my voice hardening. I walked towards the table, picking up the empty evidence box. You see this? It's where I would have kept the physical manifestation of Aris's counteragent. The one that could neutralize the weaponized bioagent he was forced to develop. His eyes flickered, a momentary tremor in his composure. It was enough. He understood the lie, and the threat it represented. You have nothing, he said, but the conviction wasn't there. Oh, I have plenty, David. I pulled a small, sealed evidence bag from my jacket pocket. Inside, a microscopic fragment, barely visible to the naked eye. Remember this? A trace polymer. Unique. He was found at the scene of Aris's accident. And, I paused, letting the weight of the next word settle, it matches the residue I found at 3 other accidental industrial incidents over the past year. Incidents where key individuals involved in bioengineering or advanced material science met untimely ends. All linked to Omnicorp subsidiaries. His face paled, the carefully constructed facade cracking. That's impossible. Is it? The same polymer, David. A specific chemical signature. Used to destabilize critical equipment, to create the illusion of catastrophic failure. It leaves behind this signature. And it was in Aris's lab. On the ruptured conduit. On his clothes. I laid the evidence bag on the table. I didn't just find it there. Your signature, David. Your method of creating accidents. He stared at the bag, then at me, trapped. His shoulders slumped. He realized what they were doing with his work. The bioweapon. He threatened to go public, to dismantle everything. Omnicorp couldn't allow it. Not after the investment, the years of development. There's a faction within the executive board. They tasked me. I was the only one with intimate knowledge of his lab, his protocols. The only one he'd trust enough to get close without suspicion. My gaze remained fixed on him, unwavering. So you murdered your own brother. He flinched, the words hanging in the air like an accusation. I neutralized him. It was an unfortunate necessity. He was becoming a liability for Omnicorp, for the project. For me. He looked away, his eyes scanning the endless rows of forgotten records. They promised me a seat on the board. The trap was sprung. The air still hummed with the aftershock of David Thorne's words. The confession, ragged and bitter, had been enough. I watched the lead investigators signal to the uniformed officers. They moved in, their movements swift and practiced, securing David Thorne without a struggle. He offered no resistance, his eyes vacant, fixed on some unseen point beyond the interrogation room's walls. The trap, indeed, had sprung. A wave of exhaustion, heavy and sudden, washed over me. It wasn't the physical kind, but the mental fatigue of holding so many disparate threads in my mind, waiting for them to finally weave together. The immediate relief was quickly replaced by a deeper, more unsettling realization: this wasn't over. This was only the beginning of the end for this specific crime, but the true magnitude of what Aris Thorne had been working on, and the lengths people would go to control it, was only just starting to surface. The next few hours were a blur of reports, debriefings, and the controlled chaos of the investigation expanding its reach. David Thorne, once processed, began to offer more details, not out of remorse, I suspected, but out of a calculated desire to bring others down with him. He spoke of corporate directives, of pressure from unseen hands, of promises of immense wealth and power that had corrupted the very core of his family's legacy. He mentioned a hidden ledger, a set of original contracts outlining the true, ethically dubious funding sources for Aris's initial research, tucked away in a place no one would ever think to look. He said to look for the Gray Swan file, the lead investigator informed me, relaying David Thorne's latest breadcrumb. An old project code. He specified the psychiatric hospital abandoned wing with old records. The words hung in the air, incongruous with the high-tech bioengineering case we'd been on. A psychiatric hospital? Abandoned? My mind immediately began to sift through the implications. Why there? What could a place like that hold that was relevant to Aris Thorne's cutting-edge work? "I'll go," I said, already reaching for my coat. The lead investigator nodded, understanding my compulsion to follow every thread to its absolute conclusion. The drive was long, taking me to the city's forgotten edges, past warehouses with boarded-up windows and overgrown lots. The building itself loomed, a skeletal edifice against the bruised twilight sky. Its windows, dark and empty, stared like vacant eyes. The air grew colder as I approached, carrying the scent of damp earth and decay. Peeling paint curled from the walls like withered skin. Empty rooms stretched out on either side, their contents long stripped away, leaving only the ghosts of forgotten lives. The smell of mildew and stagnant air was thick, clinging to my clothes. I found the records section deep within the wing, a cavernous room lined with floor-to-ceiling shelves. Thousands of files, yellowed and brittle, were stacked haphazardly, covered in decades of dust. This was a physical archive, a world away from the digital security systems of Omnicorp. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating handwritten labels, dates from eras long past. The Grey Swan file. David Thorne had been precise, if cruel, in his obscure direction. I ran my gloved hand along the spines, feeling the grit of accumulated time. It took nearly an hour, navigating the narrow aisles, my breath pluming in the cold air. Then, tucked behind a thick-bound volume on institutional budgets from the early 90s, I saw it, a slim, unassuming folder, its label faded but legible. Project Grey Swan, Initial Funding and Ethical Review. My fingers trembled slightly as I pulled it free. The paper inside was crisp, despite its age. These investors, it seemed, had a history of backing ethically questionable research, with clauses that granted them unprecedented control over any world-changing discoveries. It outlined a precedent for intellectual property acquisition that bordered on outright theft, a framework designed to bypass public scrutiny and regulatory oversight. The initial funding for Aris's foundational work, the very bedrock of his later breakthroughs, was tainted. This wasn't just about the murder, it was about the systemic corruption that enabled it, a corporate rot that reached far deeper than I had imagined. I photographed every page, my mind racing. This was the missing piece, the documentation that explained why Aris Thorne's research was so aggressively pursued, and why his life had been deemed expendable. Back in the city, the evidence from the psychiatric hospital abandoned wing with old records, combined with David Thorne's expanding confession, triggered a seismic shift. Warrants were executed. High-ranking Omnicorp executives, their faces plastered across every news channel, were taken into custody. The media erupted into a firestorm of speculation and outrage. I watched the news reports from my small apartment, the clamor of anchors and pundits filling the quiet space. The ethical debate was raging. Where did the line lie between progress and exploitation? Who owned the future of humanity, and what price were we willing to pay for it? The future of Aris Thorne's research, the very catalyst for this entire tragedy, now hung precariously. Governments and international organizations, once dismissive, were now vying for control, their representatives making urgent statements, convening emergency sessions. The prize was too great, the potential too vast, to be left unchecked. I had solved the murder, but in doing so, I had cracked open a Pandora's box, revealing the complex, dangerous intersection of ambition, power, and the terrifying potential of human ingenuity. I still held the aged document, its brittle edges threatening to crumble with every breath. My fingers, steady now, traced the faded script, each word a chilling confirmation of my suspicions. The consortium wasn't merely a group of investors. That much was clear. They were architects, not patrons. The agreements detailed a structured, long-term acquisition of intellectual property, a deliberate steering of Omnicorp's scientific trajectory, even before its public inception. Aris Thorne, in his younger, perhaps more naive days, had been a brilliant tool, his genius harnessed and directed. The document laid bare a history of influence, a subtle but relentless push towards specific research avenues, all converging on the kind of groundbreaking, world-changing discoveries Thorne had been making, discoveries that could be weaponized, monopolized, or simply controlled. I remembered the burn patterns in Thorne's lab, the microscopic traces, the carefully orchestrated chaos. It wasn't a suicide, nor a tragic miscalculation. It was an execution. Thorne, nearing the end of his life, must have seen the true endgame, the dark purpose behind the funding, the slow creep of control over his life's work. He'd tried to pull back, to reassert autonomy over his research, to perhaps even expose them. That made him a liability. The killer, then, wasn't just someone intimately familiar with the lab. It had to be a colleague, one trusted, one with access to Thorne's most secured projects, someone who understood the intricate dance of his experimental protocols. They had known precisely how to trigger a cascade failure that would mimic an accident, how to erase their own presence, how to leave just enough ambiguity to confuse a less observant eye. The weight of it settled on me, heavy and suffocating. This wasn't just about the murder of a brilliant scientist, it was about the insidious corruption of scientific pursuit itself. I thought of the countless hours I'd spent sifting through wreckage, piecing together fragments of a life extinguished, and now, the true scope of the injustice was laid bare. It wasn't just a single act of violence, but the culmination of decades of careful manipulation. My gaze drifted across the decaying shelves, rows of forgotten files, each holding a fragment of a person's story. This place, a repository of minds deemed broken, now housed the key to a different kind of brokenness, the shattered ethics of an industry. The irony wasn't lost on me. The personal toll of this case had been significant. Sleepless nights blurred into restless days, haunted by the image of Thorne's lab, the sheer devastation, and the precise, calculated malice behind it. It was a relentless pursuit, demanding a part of me I wasn't always sure I had to give. The tension remained, a persistent hum beneath the surface of my skin. Unmasking the killer was one thing, but bringing such a powerful, pervasive consortium to justice felt like an entirely different battle. The evidence was compelling, but their reach, their influence, was vast. I knew the fight was far from over. I carefully refolded the document, slipping it into a protective sleeve I'd brought. It was a tangible link to a truth some would prefer to remain buried. Thorne's case, in its tragic finality, served as a stark reminder: progress, unchecked by ethical boundaries, could become a profound peril. The promise of groundbreaking discovery, when corrupted by avarice, could lead to monstrous outcomes. As I turned to leave the silent, dusty wing, the faint echo of my footsteps seemed to mock the quiet. Thorne's murder had been solved, the intricate web of deceit unraveled, the motive laid bare. Yet, the larger struggle, the ongoing tug-of-war between advancement and accountability, between innovation and exploitation, stretched out before me, an unending horizon. And I, Reid, would be there, meticulously sifting through the wreckage, searching for the truth, no matter how deeply buried or how powerful the forces trying to keep it hidden. The fight, I knew, had only just begun.